Ezekiel. We've been working through this prophetic book. Will remind us kind of where we're at. As you know, the story of the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, after they get out of Exodus, or after they get out of Egypt and Exodus, and they go through this kind of claiming the land, and then they get the monarchy, right? Saul and David and Solomon. And we kind of think about that as the golden age of Israel. And that's in about 1000, is when David's on the throne, about 1000 BC. And the golden age doesn't last very long. That's when the palace gets built in Jerusalem. It's really when Jerusalem becomes the capital of Israel. It's when the temple gets built under Solomon. And then after Solomon, the nation splits. And back and forth, and it doesn't go well for any of the kings. There's the north and the south. They call them Israel and Judah. And about 300 years in, the north gets conquered and captured by Assyria. And then about 400 years in, give or take, the south, Judah, gets conquered by Babylon. And some of those folks get deported, the kind of the higher-ups, right? The ruling class get deported to Babylon. And they're treated well, but it is part of Babylon holding control, right? So we're about 400 years after King David. Ezekiel's one of those that gets deported. So he's in Babylon, and he's prophesying to the Jews that are in Babylon. So we might say like a white-collar class of Jews who, it's really their fault, a lot of the issues that came about, because the ruling class, or the kings and the king's people, were the ones who were continually turning away from God, worshiping idols, and that trickles down, but you could lay a lot of the blame on the governing folks. So Ezekiel is prophesying, and a lot of Ezekiel's language and imagery is speaking to a culture that's living in the city of Babylon, right? If he was prophesying in Brownwood, we might hear lots of imagery about a big cowboy, and barbecue, like Underwoods, or we might hear about the lake, or the lake being low, or things like that. There's imageries and kind of stories that get told in Babylon that's part of their culture that Ezekiel kind of conscripts into his prophecies about Judah. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at. Ezekiel, and he's not afraid to be lewd and try to get some people's eyes to open and go, can he say that? Can this prophet say that? And he's just put it out there. So we're in chapter 24, verse 1. In the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th day, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, record this date, this very date, because the king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem this very day. So remember, I told you, Babylon's already conquered Jerusalem, but Babylon will go back and reconquer them because those that remained in Jerusalem rebelled and thought they could maybe rid themselves of their Babylonian overlords. And so they rebelled. The problem is that God had told them, we read this in Jeremiah and a bit of Isaiah, but particularly Jeremiah, hey, don't fight back. This is part of my judgment. Now, it's going to end. The Babylonian rule is going to end. But it's not going to end on your terms. It's going to end on mine. That's kind of the message we get through Jeremiah. Well, they don't like Jeremiah's words. They don't like hearing that. They don't like being under the thumb of Babylon. So they decided, well, we'll trust in our own allies. They made allies with Egypt. Said, they'll have our back. And then turns out they didn't have their back. And what ends up happening is Babylon and their armies and the king come down. And while they could have been at peace with Babylon, instead they chose to resist. And when Babylon sieged Jerusalem, they end up breaking down the walls of Jerusalem, which makes the city uninhabitable in this day and age, and destroy the temple. And the temple's not going to get rebuilt until Ezra and Nehemiah, 100 or so years, 200 years later. But it could have been avoidable. We kind of see that through Jeremiah's eyes. It could have been avoidable. But this is part of the judgment. Ezekiel 24 is telling us this is the day. So Ezekiel's not in Jerusalem, but God is speaking to him and saying, today, mark the day. This is the day that the siege is beginning. And so some of this is the Jews kind of hearing of this news too. Okay, verse 3. Tell this rebellious people a parable and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Put on the cooking pot, put it on and pour water into it. Put into it the pieces of meat, all the choice pieces, the leg and the shoulder. Fill it with the best of these bones. Take the pick of the flock. Pile wood beneath it for the bones. Bring it to a boil and cook the bones in it. Okay, so what they're describing is what you would do if you were going to offer meat as a sacrifice in the temple. You could do a cooking pot in lots of places, a big stew pot or something. But particularly in the temple, we hear stories of what they do is they boil this big cauldron pot, and you would you'd choose the best of the flock, right? An unblemished lamb, and you'd sacrifice it, then you'd cook it. You could cook it with lots of things, right? Because what's going to happen is the priests are also going to eat from this, but they're not going to eat all of it. Typically what they do is they put in a fork, and whatever comes out, maybe they'd say beforehand, this is the part for God, and they put it in and take it out. And in some ways, there's a randomness to it that's kind of like casting lots, they might call it, And if he got the coveted drumstick on Thanksgiving, when you stick it in, well, that's God's, right? But if you only got the dark meat and you don't like that and it comes out, that part's God's. Whatever it was, that's what you ought to do. And then after what was God, the first fruits or whatever you got out, then the priests would eat whatever's left. So this is kind of what you're getting an image of, but they would have said, oh, this is something to do with sacrificial cooking and a temple practice. Okay, verse 6. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, woe to the city of bloodshed, to the pot now encrusted, whose deposit will not go away. Take the meat out piece by piece in whatever order it comes. So he's talking about Jerusalem, the city of bloodshed here. He says, and the pot's now encrusted, and the deposit won't go away. Well, when you cook in big pots, it crusts up on the bottom, and you got to clean them. Or you got to keep cooking them until they're so charred that they flake off, right? Depends on the kind of pot you're using. But here he's saying that crust isn't coming off. The deposits aren't coming off. And start taking the meat out piece by piece in whatever order that it comes. Verse 7, for the blood she shed is in her midst. She poured it out on the bare rock. She did not pour it on the ground where the dust would cover it. To stir up wrath and take revenge, I put her blood on the bare rock so that it would not be covered. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, woe to the city of bloodshed, I too will pile the wood high. So heap on the wood and kindle the fire. Cook the meat well, mixing in the spices, and let the bones be charred. So cook the meat well, kind of fall off the bones, right? That's the idea. So much that the bones are charred. Then set the empty pot on the coals till it becomes hot and its copper glows, so that its impurities may be melted and its deposit burned away. This is another image of, this is probably a temple imagery, right? A typical cooking pot is probably going to be clay. But when you're using the temple, we hear about gold and silver pots. Here, a copper pot makes sense that this is probably something to do with temple cooking. Because it says the copper is going to glow. That's how hot it's getting. Well, why is it getting hot? Because you poured it all out. Now you're trying to char that deposits, right? And get it to where you can flake it off. The impurities can be melted away, right? That's what it says. It deposits burned away, verse 11. Verse 12, it has frustrated all efforts. Its heavy deposit has not been removed, not even by fire. Now, your impurity is lewdness. So he says the impurity, the crusted stuff, the pot's cooking, Jerusalem, and all this stuff that even after the fire, even after the coals and it's glowing, isn't coming off. And then he tells us, what is that? He says, it's your lewdness, because I tried to cleanse you, but you would not be cleansed from your impurity. You will not be clean again until my wrath against you has subsided. I, the Lord, have spoken. The time has come for me to act. I will not hold back. I will not have pity, nor will I relent. You will be judged according to your conduct and your actions, declares the sovereign Lord. So he's saying, today's the day. Jerusalem is under siege by Nebuchadnezzar. And don't think that you might get out of it like you hear about Hezekiah and those stories of the past when the Lord delivered the people who were in Jerusalem. It's not happening this time. That's the message here. I'm not going to relent. Because I've tried to relent, I thought, if we cooked it hot enough, it would flake off. We'd get that off. But no, it hasn't gotten off. So what are we going to do? We're going to just have to destroy it utterly is the message we're getting here. All right, verse 15. The word of the Lord came to me. So this becomes a second. So every time we hear that, the word of the Lord came to me, it becomes another prophecy. It's kind of a break in, okay, we're not talking about the pot anymore, but maybe it's something similar to that. Verse 16, Son of man, with one blow I'm about to take away from you the delight of your eyes. Yet do not lament or weep or shed any tears. Groan quietly. Do not mourn for the dead. Keep your turban fastened and your sandals on your feet. Do not cover your mustache and beard or eat the customary food of mourners. So I spoke to the people in the morning, and in the evening my wife died. The next morning I did as I had been commanded. So often we hear of prophets who their actions, the way that they live them out, are prophetic messages. We almost might think of them as street performers. Or it's not just getting behind a pulpit and preaching a message. What they would do is they'd act out a message. Early in Ezekiel, we saw some of that, where he played war and said, this is what's going to happen to Jerusalem. And he's the one who laid on his side, and he cooked food. He said, this is because you're going to be under siege for this long. And here, God plays into this a little bit. And this is, your wife's going to die. Here's the prophetic message, is you don't get to mourn like others would mourn. Typically, there'd be a mourning period, and you put coverings on, and there's all sorts of things you would do, and everyone would know that your wife died, but also they'd see, and there's kind of this cultural expectation that you're going to do these things to mourn. And you would take time to do that. But the prophetic message here for Ezekiel is, your wife's going to die, but you don't get to mourn. And we'll hear that kind of played out why that's the case. Verse 19. Then the people asked me, won't you tell us what these things have to do with us? Why are you acting like this? So they know, because he's a prophet, that some of the things that he's doing are messages, but they're asking him, you're acting crazy here. It would have been crazy to them for you to not be mourning. Why are you acting like this? It's socially odd. What does this have to do with us? Clearly, you've got a message. Verse 20. So I said to them, the word of the Lord came to me. Say to the people of Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm about to desecrate my sanctuary, the stronghold in which you take pride, the delight of your eyes, the object of your affection. The sons and daughters you left behind will fall by the sword. So he's saying, the message here is Jerusalem's about to die, right? That's the idea here. The temple is going to get destroyed. It's going to be desecrated. The thing that you're so proud of, but you don't actually do what I say, but it's going to be destroyed. And the sons and daughters that you left behind, those that were still in Jerusalem, the Jews back in Jerusalem, they're going to be cut down by the sword. Verse 22, and you will do as I have done. You will not cover your mustache and beard or eat the customary food of mourners. You will keep your turbans on your heads and your sandals on your feet. You will not mourn or weep, but will waste away because of your sins and groan among yourselves. Ezekiel will be assigned to you. You will do as he has done. When this happens, you will know that I am the sovereign Lord. Now, I think for Ezekiel, the message is, you don't get to participate in mourning. And this is a hard message for him to hear, right? I would imagine this is a hard thing for him to do. I tend to think that this is a message of, here's what's coming. It's not telling the Jews who aren't really following God anyway, Oh, you don't get to mourn over Jerusalem. Well, they don't follow God anyway. I think the message is Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, and you're not going to care. You're not going to mourn like you should. You're not going to take off your turbans, and you're not going to put things over your eyes, and you're not going to be mourning this great loss. Why? Because you're in Babylon, and you think things will be all right. Things are going to be fine. We don't have to worry. Things have worked out so far. I think that's the message here. Ezekiel, you do this, and people are going to say, why are you doing this? Because I'm not mourning when I should be. Well, why are you doing that? Because your wife, the Jerusalem, is going to be destroyed, and you're not going to care. And you're going to know that I'm the Lord when you see all this playing out. I think that's the message here that's being presented. Verse 25. And you, son of man, on the day I take away their stronghold, their joy and glory, the delight of their eyes, their heart's desire, and their sons and daughters as well, on that day a fugitive will come to tell you the news. At that time your mouth will be opened, you will speak with him, and will no longer be silent. So you will be a sign to them, and will know that I am the Lord. So we get the cooking pot here. Jerusalem's under siege. It's going to be destroyed, and they're not going to be able to mourn. Maybe, it could be they're not going to care. I suppose it could be, too, they're in Babylon. And who's doing the destroying? Babylon. We can't run the risk of the police or whoever saying, what are you? You're loyal to those, usurpers? No. So it could be that, too. For whatever reason, though, they're not going to mourn, and they're not going to get to. All right, chapter 25, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, set your face against the Ammonites and prophesy against them. Say to them, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because you said, aha, over my sanctuary when it was desecrated, and over the land of Israel when it was laid waste, and over the people of Judah when they went into exile. Therefore, I am going to give you to the people of the east as a possession. They will set up their camps and pitch their tents among you. They will eat your fruit and drink your milk. I will turn Rabbah into a pasture for camels and Ammon into a resting place for sheep. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So, Ammonites, if we think of Israel, the land of Israel, then the Jordan River is kind of the easternmost border, right? There's a little bit here or there, but the Ammonites are on the other side. They're neighbors on the Jordan River, north to the north. And here the prophecy is saying, you think that when you were celebrating the destruction of Jerusalem, well, here's this message against you because you were celebrating. And it says those people from the east, they don't give a message. Now, all of the enemies that we know of, the big bullies, come from the east, but we tend to hear them as described as coming from the north. Assyria and Babylon. I haven't drawn a map in a while, so I'm going to do it. Yeah. So the Jordan River, we'll have the Mediterranean Sea over here, right? The Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee, and then far over here, I won't draw it because it'll be too far over, but the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and then Babylon is over here. And they follow, they would travel the Fertile Crescent, is what we call it today, the rivers, and then they would come down from the north to attack. So in Jeremiah, they're described as the king from the north, or the people from the north, when really, geographically, they're from the east, but it makes sense why they call them from the north, because that's the direction they're coming from. When he says the people to the east, well, Ammon is kind of this area, right? But the people to the east of that, there's a desert between the Fertile Crescent. Most of this is desert. Well, the people from the east that he's talking about are like Bedouins, right? They're we might think of like Arabians, right? The merchants that are nomads. They don't necessarily have towns. They ride camels, and they would have been a nomadic people. And that's why it says here, I'm going to turn Rabbah into a pasture for camels, because the people from the east are going to come and they're going to destroy you, and their camels instead of sheep are going to graze on your land. Um, and they will, it says before that, verse 4, at the end of verse 4, they'll pitch their tents among you. Remember, they're nomads. They'll eat your fruit and drink your milk. The thing that you might produce most if you don't have great farmland is you're going to produce milk from your flocks. You're going to produce fruit from vines. And they're going to be eating and drinking the choicest of your production, right? All right, verse 6. This is what the sovereign Lord says, because you've clapped your hands and stamped your feet, rejoicing with all the malice of your heart against the land of Israel. Therefore I will stretch out my hand against you and give you as plunder to the nations. I will wipe you out from among the nations and exterminate you from the countries. I will destroy you, and you will know that I am the Lord. So we get this prophecy against the Ammonites. We saw this in Isaiah. We saw it in Jeremiah, this prophecy against others. We'll see it a lot of the minor prophets. Prophecy against kind of the neighbors tends to be kind of a pattern that we see in ancient literature. It's not necessarily to the neighbors. It's to the Jews as a little bit of a message of God's a God of justice, and he's going to seek justice on those that have done damage to you. But typically in these, it's always the biggest piece of the pie of justice is to God's people, right? To the Jews here. But we get the Ammonites here. Okay, verse 8. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because Moab and Seir said, look, Judah has become like all the other nations. Therefore I will expose the flank of Moab, beginning at its frontier towns, Beth Jeshimoth, Baal Meon, and Kiriathaim, the glory of that land. I will give Moab, along with the Ammonites, to the people of the east as a possession, so that the Ammonites will not be remembered among the nations. And I will inflict punishment on Moab, and they will know that I am the Lord. So Moab, same kind of thing happens. Moab is more, they're also east, but they're more south, right? These are kind of general drawings, right? But again, to the east of Moab is the desert as well. So they're saying that the Ammonites and Moabites are going to also experience this. Why? Because they rejoiced at the destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 12, this is what the sovereign Lord says, because Edom took revenge on Judah and became very guilty by doing so. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I will stretch out my hand against Edom and kill both man and beast. I will lay it waste, and from Teman to Dedan they will fall by the sword. I'll take vengeance on Edom by the hand of my people Israel, and they will deal with Edom in accordance with my anger and my wrath. They will know my vengeance, declares the sovereign Lord. So Edom is another on, I don't know, I think they're more southern down here. But Edom, they're mentioned multiple times, but there's a whole minor prophet dedicated to Edom and how they failed to respond to the refugees, essentially, from Jerusalem, right? Those that were fleeing destruction who said, or didn't come to the aid when they could have. And the Edomites are descendants of Esau. And so Jacob and Esau, those twins from Isaac, Jacob ends up getting the blessing and the promise when we see Jacob becomes Israel, right? And his 12 sons and whatnot. But at their roots, they're brothers, they're twin brothers. And so even though they're not the people of the promise, they still ought to, you're still kin, right? And you still ought to help one another out. But the Edomites had hard feelings. I mean, the Jews had the hard feelings too, right? But when the Jews were in trouble, the Edomites didn't help. And so that's why we hear some of this prophecy against them. We know that they were either neutral with Babylon or pro-Babylon. We don't know exactly, but that's the kind of the tone we get from the Edomites is they don't care too much. They think that they can play the game better than everybody else can play the game when everybody's trying to play the political game there. All right, verse 15. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because the Philistines acted in vengeance and took revenge with malice in their hearts, and with ancient hostility sought to destroy Judah, therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm about to stretch out my hand against the Philistines, and I will wipe out the Kerethites and destroy those remaining along the coast. I will carry out vengeance on them and punish them in my wrath. Then they will know that I am the Lord when I take vengeance on them. And the Philistines were coastal people, and so they were, I don't know where that border necessarily would go, but they are neighbors to Judah, but neighbors on the west, and they were on the coast. And we hear a lot about the Philistines, particularly when David is becoming king, right? Goliath was a Philistine. They were major enemies then. They become less important or less strong as a world power as we might think in this kind of day and age. Never seem to be reconciled necessarily to Judah, but anytime Egypt, who's down here, would come up to attack, the first place they got to go through is the Philistines. So the Philistines kind of become the easy pickings, and so they're not very strong even at this time. And then the Kerethites, it mentions them, is usually mentioned, they're kind of the seafaring people. So it makes sense. The Philistines were seafaring people, and we wonder, did they come from across the sea, like the Mediterranean Sea? Crete, the island of Crete, is kind of associated with the Kerethites, and then maybe their ancestors took ships and landed on the shores and kind of created the nation of the Philistines, or at some point were there as travelers and kind of rooted in with them. We don't quite know, but that's why they mention them. They're essentially Cretes or Greeks, the Kerethites. Okay, chapter 26, verse 1. In the 11th month of the 12th year, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, because Tyre has said of Jerusalem, Aha, the gate of the nation is broken, and all its doors have swung open to me. Now that she lies in ruins, I will prosper. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Tyre, and I'll bring many nations against you, like the sea casting up its waves. They will destroy the walls of Tyre and pull down her towers. I will scrape away her rubble and make her a bare rock. So Tyre is going to be a more northern coastal city. So you kind of see we're getting different geographical locations, but Tyre is further north, and we're getting a prophecy against him. Verse 5. Out in the sea shall become a place to spread fish nets, for I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. She will become plunder for the nations, and her settlements on the mainland will be ravaged by the sword. Then they will know that I am the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. From the north, I'm going to bring against Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses and chariots, with horsemen and a great army. So there you get from the north. So Babylon and before them Assyria would travel. They'd coming from the north. Here Nebuchadnezzar coming from the north. Verse 8, he will ravage your settlement on the mainland with a sword. He will set up siege works against you, build a ramp up to your walls, raise a shield against you. He will direct the blows of his battering rams against your walls and demolish your towers with his weapons. His horses will be so many that they will cover you with dust. Your walls will tremble at the noise of the war horses, wagons, and chariots, when he enters your gates as men enter a city whose walls have been broken through. The hooves of his horse will trample all your streets. He will kill your people with the sword, and your strong pillars will fall to the ground. They will plunder your wealth and loot your merchandise. They'll break down your walls, demolish your fine houses, and throw your stones, timber, and rubble into the sea. I will put an end to your noisy songs, and the music of your harps will be heard no more. I'll make you a bare rock, and you will become a place of spread fish nets. You will never be rebuilt. For I, the Lord, have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. So I don't know why we get a little bit longer of a message against Tyre, but I can't help but hear this message of your walls are going to be destroyed, and this is how bad it's going to be, and the sound of hooves are going to be so, ominously loud, and you're going to be covered in dust because of all the horses. Well, we know And Nebuchadnezzar is coming to Jerusalem to do the same thing. So in some ways, this feels like it may be a prophecy against Tyre, but we know he's also coming. That same fear ought to be sparked in the Jews as well. All right, verse 15. This is what the sovereign Lord says of Tyre. Will not the coastlands tremble at the sound of your fall when the wounded groan and the slaughter takes place in you? Then all the princes of the coast will step down from their thrones and lay aside their robes and take off their embroidered garments. Clothed with terror, they will sit on the ground trembling every moment, appalled at you. Then they will take up a lament concerning you and say to you, how you are destroyed, city of renown, people by men of the sea. You are a power of the seas, you and your citizens. You put your terror on all who live there. Now the coastlands tremble on the day of your fall. The islands in the sea are terrified at your collapse. That's probably, part of this is Tyre is, while the Philistines are seafaring people, Tyre is kind of the quintessential trade capital of the sea, right? These are the merchant traders. Others can do it, but Tyre are really good at it. And so if that got destroyed, well, what's everybody going to do, right? The central source of the economy of at least trading by sea is destroyed. That's going to put ripples throughout the known world, right? Those islands at the sea are going to be terrified by it. Okay, verse 19. This is what the sovereign Lord says. When I make you a desolate city, like cities no longer inhabited, when I bring the ocean depths over you and its vast waters cover you, then I will bring you down with those who go down to the pit, to the people of long ago. I will make you dwell in the earth below as in ancient ruins, with those who go down to the pit. And you will not return or take your place in the land of the living. I will bring you to a horrible end, and you will be no more. You will be sought, but you will never again be found, declares the sovereign Lord. So we get these messages, but particularly of Tyre saying, you're going to be thrown into the sea. You will be no more. All of your stones of your towers will be thrown into the sea, your timber and all of that, and you'll be covered by it. And again, that message, I think, is intended to invoke some terror in the Jews as well. To say, if it could happen to the economic superpower up here of Tyre, well, man, what's stopping them from doing it to us? So we'll pause there. We'll pick up chapter 27 next week. But any thoughts or questions or things that we read so far?
One question.
Yeah.
Where is Sidon? SIDDON or whatever?
Yeah, it's just north of Tyre. So we hear both of them together, Tyre and Sidon, and so it's another city just north of them.
Okay, I wondered because you always see it connected, and I thought, you hadn't mentioned it, and I thought, what happened there?
Yeah. Modern day Lebanon is where that's located.
Philistine area.
Yeah.
Kind of where Gaza is.
Yeah, so Gaza, where the conflict is right now, is in ancient Israel would have been the Philistines would have kind of occupied that area. You hear about some of this in the aid coming from the coast. It's a coastal area, Gaza is, and so the Philistines occupied the coastal regions. Yeah.
What was the other place where they used to send all the trees?
Lebanon, or cedars of Lebanon, right? And so they're getting those from Tyre and Sidon, right? Whether they're cutting them down here or sending them they're using, these are the hub. You might say like the stock exchange, if it goes through New York City, right? That's the idea here is this is everything trade-wise is probably coming through them if it's getting traded on a ship.
Well, like sent to Solomon when he was building the Lord's house and his own house. They sent it by water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So much of this
reminds me of an ancient earthly version of sinners in the hands of an angry God.
Mm.
Because people forget about, everybody wants to talk about the loving, forgiving God, and people forget about his anger and vengeance, and that's what's being poured out here.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it started, people, reminding people of it, it started the,
Great Awakening.
thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, Jonathan Edwards preached sinners in the hands of an angry God. He'd just go around and he'd preach it to other places, and people would fall down wailing when they hear these words and repentance. And I think truly we hear about the Great Awakening. It wasn't just him, but there was a lot of spiritual awakening happening in America at the time. I don't know how true this is, but I had heard that Jonathan Edwards was a pretty monotone preacher. You read it and you go, man, this guy just sounds like the epitome of a fire and brimstone, Baptist preacher. And it was fire and brimstone, but